Hello, we're glad to be with you again today. Today, as I'm speaking to you, is a important day for us all. This is exactly 1 week before the elections of 2016. It's November 1. We're happy again to be with you. My name is Dan Brook. I'm a retired academic and cleric from Hudson. I'll let our three panelists introduce themselves in a little bit, but we're happy to have Rob and Dean and Oskan here again. They'll tell you a little bit about themselves. The topic today is one that is sort of in the forefront of our minds these days. It has to do with what the core leadership values are according to the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim faith, Islamic faith. And the question is important, I think, at this time to discuss because in the midst of an election you hear all sorts of comments about leadership, moral leadership, who would make good leaders, and so the topic is to sort of look at what each of our religious perspectives has to say about who would be a good leader of people generally, but particularly now in our old culture as leaders from the city to the county to the state to the federal level are being chosen in just 1 week. The reason it's probably worth talking about a little bit is because we have historically in our country felt that the moral leaders of our country were in the religious community. The rabbis, the pastors, the priests, the imams, who provide the kind of moral guidance we need that our leaders depend upon to make the kind of decisions they make. Yet, as I was researching this a little bit, it came to me as a surprise that in the last 30 or 40 years or so, the number of people who go to the religious leaders for advice, for moral direction, have really declined in how much people listen to them. For example, a few years ago, the Scientific American did a study where they asked people in a sample, a random sample, to rank 8 categories of people who they would most trust, and this is the direct quote, to provide accurate information about important issues in society. And they had what was called, for you scientific people, a Likert scale on, if you chose 1, that was strongly distrust. If you chose 5, it was strongly trust, and any point in between. And to my surprise, clergy were at the very bottom of the list. They ranked at about 1.5. They ranked even below political elected officials who ranked at 1.8. And companies who ranked at about 1.8, journalists even ranked at 2.8, and citizens groups, the largest, ranked at about 2.9. But anyway, it was a shock to me that in terms of who these people said they would most count on to provide accurate information about important issues in society, clergy ranked the lowest. Shortly thereafter, the Reader's Digest again chose a sample to find out who the 100 most influential people were in our culture. And they do that every now and then. The last one they did a couple of years ago, I read the top 100 people. It took us to the rank of, I think, 57th to find the first clergy who was ranked as influential. It was a rabbi. And all the way down to 68 to get to the first Christian pastor. Above them were politicians and actors and athletes and so on and so forth. And then very recently in this election, an interesting thing has started to happen where leadership qualities became divided on political issues. So, for example, in the news just the last few weeks, one of the major Christian universities in our country, and actually quite highly respected, is Liberty University. And at the beginning of the election process, or in January, I think it was, something like that, the president of Liberty University, Jerry Falwell Jr., endorsed Donald Trump for president. It so upset some of the students and faculty members at Liberty University that the head of the executive committee of the board of directors resigned. As of this point, there are over 2,000 faculty members and students who have issued a formal and very public letter published in the New York Times saying that Jerry Falwell, by committing to one particular candidate, had, in quotes, "It's not Christ-like behavior that Liberty has spent 40 years promoting with its students." So we got all sorts of mischief all of a sudden in the world and in our own country about the role religious leaders play in the processing of elections. We talked a little bit with Özkan. His native Turkey has gone through a recent coup led in part by a religious leader. And as I'd mentioned in one prior one, there was a book written about 40 years ago called Holy Terror. And it was outlining in detail all the cultures of the world and the various things that were happening in the religious community that were predicted to give rise to what is happening today, where the religious community has served as a divisive force in the world and brought us to the point where we have brothers and sisters fighting against brothers and sisters over religious or religiously connected ideological issues. So here we are. We're going to address today essentially one question. Give an example of core leadership values according to your faith. And we'll start with Rob. Rob, you want to introduce yourself again? I mean, most people know how notorious you are in the community and probably recognize you right away, but it's a good story.
Why, thank you. My name is Rob Wertheimer. I'm a lawyer in downtown Hudson, Wisconsin. I've been in the area since 1989. I'm originally from New York. I'm Jewish, and I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. And my mom was a hidden child during World War II. So with regard to what we're talking about today, I did a little bit of research about the attributes of a leader according to Jewish theology. And a couple of the things I found were interesting is that one of the attributes they find is that first, do no harm, just like the Hippocratic Oath for a leader. Another one was that Moses himself was not able by himself to bear all the burdens of acting as a leader, or as they call it, a rabbi or a judge in the community. And he was not required to administer justice alone. Only God judges alone, is from Deuteronomy. And so it was deemed that ideal leadership is not a solo act, it's more like an ensemble, and that delegation of the leadership role is encouraged. That's what I'm looking for. And then, to have the attributes of valor, strength, capability, and to basically, so to be a communal leader, to do no harm, to be capable, to show also, where's the other part here? To not be concerned with accolades and recognition for your service, but focus instead on the job itself with the best motivations. So don't hide from the praise, but don't seek it either. Basically, be confident, have true humility. So really the most interesting thing I came out of that was that it isn't just one person leading, but it's an idea of leading together with the heads of the tribes, the elders, other officers and delegates. It's all of the people of Israel we're told to lead together. So, and I thought that was very interesting. So that's what I came up with to start.
Thanks. That's a good introduction. I've written a few notes and we'll follow up on that. Dean?
Yeah, Dean Simpson, pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And living here outside of Roberts, near Hudson here, since 1991. So I'm a native Wisconsinite. When I think of some of our traditional Christian writings on leadership, one of the first things that come to mind, and I'm going to have to be careful here because I'm guilty of just the opposite, and I could be here today if I don't watch myself, but is that verse from James that says, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And Rob, when you're talking about the wisdom of ancient Israel in solid leadership, it's not just one. You mentioned it requires some humility, and it's a communal effort. I would imagine that to pull that off, you got to have people willing to listen to one another. To form true community, you have to have the sense, you have to communicate the sense that when others speak, you're willing to truly listen. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. I think we see just the opposite among a lot of us, both political leaders and leaders of communities today. We're so impatient and so quick to become reactive against one another. It's just the charged atmosphere in which we're living, and it's like an unclean spirit among us. And if we could remember how important it is to listen and to communicate first that we're listening, that we're willing to hear what people have to say, I think that's an essential quality of leadership that we need and that's missing. So I'll leave it there to start with.
Thanks. Askan?
Thank you. I'm Ascan Kilic, and I'm a professor of marketing at the University of Wisconsin here in Rural Falls. I'm native Turkish, but naturalized a few years back, so proud American, let's put it that way. It's been 12 years now. We live in Rural Falls, and we're in this area. So first, I just want to talk a little bit, one sentence about the importance of leadership. According to John Maxwell, he is the author of this famous book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. He says, everything rises and falls on leadership. So it is very important, which means I want to put the emphasis on the upcoming election, so to vote for the right leader. Again, right and wrong depends on how we perceive it. That's fun. According Islam, I just want to cite a hadith, a word from the Prophet Muhammad, and it says, all of you are shepherds, and each of you is responsible for his or her flocks, which means leadership means responsibility, and it is a very heavy task if you are running for a leadership position, so which requires certain qualities. And according to Islam, I just want to cite few qualities, and then we may discuss about those qualities and incorporate them. So what is the leadership model according the Islamic faith, which actually doesn't tell anything about Islam, but comes with some qualities. The first one is faith and belief. Faith in the judgment day, faith in accountability and being judged by the Almighty is the very first leadership quality. Because whoever has faith and believes in being judged according his or her deeds in the day of judgment by the Almighty God, really there's no other quality needed, because you're holding yourself accountable for your own deeds, and that's what really matters actually. The second one is knowledge and wisdom, courage and determination, mutual consultation, which means a leader is is not a person who decides on him or herself. It's not a tyrant. It's not a dictator. He or she is consulting. It's a joint decision for the good of the people. Morality and piety. So there's so many other moral codes that have to be incorporated in a leadership, and piety, and which will eventually result in honesty and being a trustworthy person. Superior communication, and I believe, communication means being a good speaker, right? So we have all these debates going on, and it's all about how good of a speaker this person was, but it's just one aspect. You can win these or you can lose. It doesn't mean that you have, So in which of these qualities do we put much emphasis? That's the question maybe we can discuss later on. Justice and compassion. So you have to be just. You can't exclude anyone. You have to be inclusive. No matter which religion, which race, ethnicity, which social class or whatever you come from, you have to be just and you have to be compassionate. You have to be able to cry if someone is hurt in your community. If you don't cry as a leader, you can't be, I'm sorry, you're not my leader. I'm sorry. Patience and endurance in what you're doing. And commitment and sacrifice. Loyalty. Because if you have to commit it to this good cause, and you have to be able to sacrifice what you have. And good leaders in the past have sacrificed themselves. Jesus did, other prophets did, Muhammad did, right? If a leader can sacrifice him or herself, I couldn't consider this person to lead me because it's then all about their interest, not ours. I'm sorry to make some comment as well. Lifelong endeavor, which means a leadership is not just you assume for 4 years. You're a leader of your family, a leader of your community. You can be a leader anywhere, and it's a lifelong experience. And gratitude and prayers. Gratitude just to the Almighty, what He has given to you, but also to them, to those people who elected you, right? And the prayers go to God for all the support you get from your people. Okay, that's so far. Those 11, yeah.
Well, first of all, it sounds to me like there's a lot of consensus among the three faiths in terms of what constitutes the qualities of a good leader. I shouldn't say it surprised me. It interests me that the one word that none of the three of you used was the word power. Now, are you all suggesting that whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, that power and leadership are not syncretic sort of attributes, or what happened to power with you guys?
It would be important to define power.
Yes.
In the Christian faith, we look to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, and we see a person without official sanction, that is, without what we usually think of as power. He had no official position, and yet he spoke with a kind of an authority. When people spoke, they knew he was telling the truth, and so he did have a kind of moral power, a persuasiveness that the people didn't see in their official leaders. So power is, I think, an attribute of leadership. Surely I see Jesus as a leader, and he had power. He had personal spiritual authority or power. But I think more than power or influence, he had a kind of an integrity so that he would not misuse that power. So power can be seen as a tool, a necessary tool. I think leaders, though, need to have the inner sort of integrity and courage and humility to know how to rightfully use power in service of the common good and so on. So interesting, we didn't mention power, but I think power is an important topic to talk about when we talk about leadership.
I think it's power in the way that it's a power where people will follow you, but towards a greater good, towards making ourselves, society, and the world into something better. So if you have that type of power where you can lead and people can follow and by your example, and you can create change for the good, then the power is obviously a good thing. But obviously, if someone's seeking power for power's sake, that becomes a negative. That becomes more of what they call a separation from God and from doing what's right. And so obviously it's got to be tempered.
So the power is the ability of someone to influence others' decisions or actions. And I think the power is the ability, but what's more important is the source of power. If you use a coercive source, the ability to punish, and the only way to influence is punishment, then it's a power that we don't desire. The power is more the reference power or the reward power that comes from those leadership qualities we mentioned here. That's the reason why we didn't express the word power, but all these if someone has these qualities to a certain degree, is able to influence others in we call it reference power or rewarding power rather than a coercive power. So I think that's the reason why we never mention this, because we assume that if you have these to a certain, you will be able to influence. And I think the word power has been misperceived, or there's a misconception that, okay, I have power over, let's say, my kids, but it's not just I'm forcing them. It's because I'm a reference. They love me and they follow what I say. I think that's what you meant with
That's what we're talking
Jesus.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who said, those among you who would be the greatest must become the least and the servant of all. We're not going to exercise power over as the great leaders do. We distinguish between power, which is a good thing, and force, which is coercive power.
Yeah.
And those who have no power or perceive themselves as powerless will resort to force and power over and coercion, instead of taking the place of the servant, which is an important place. And I certainly know both from the Old and New Testament scriptures that the king in ancient Israel was to be seen as shepherd of the flock of God, so one who takes care of them and leads them to green pastures and so on. So that's there in our religious tradition. What's interesting to me is that in the background of all three of our faiths is the story of Israel, the story of Abraham and his people. There was no difference between the religious tradition and the cultural and political. It was all one culture. We've got that divided now, so you can say, oh, we don't trust religious leaders. Well, in the time when our scriptures were written, there was no distinction between religious and political.
The rabbis were the leaders.
Yeah. And so what it meant to be a religious leader was to be a good king, a good politician, a good ruler in government, and to serve the people. And rather than the kind of careerism that tempts us in a culture like ours now, which has got so much money to reward people who get a big name and then can make good deals to get themselves enriched. Money has been a real problem at the core of our political system. One of the writers of the New Testament, St. Paul, warns that the love of money is the root of all evil. And it can corrupt clergy, and it can corrupt politicians, and can corrupt lots of others as well.
I would concur what you say. It's really, if it's all about materialism, and I know we vote for someone to lead us in this life, but our actions here in this life will determine, that's the way I believe, how we're going to live hereafter. So it is important to me that I'm not talking about a religious leader, but I'm talking about someone who's going to lead me here in this life, should have certain aspects and attributes of someone who could support me in a better life hereafter. And I'm not talking about a religious person. I'm talking about a leader that opens up an environment where I could live in peace, inner peace, and with peace with others. And none of our candidates here or somewhere else is dealing with that. It's all about here, and then it's all about the money.
And power.
Yes.
Money and power, yikes.
So let me summarize. In terms of power, you all agree that power is of two types really. Coercive, that is, having something whereby you have the ability to force somebody to do something against their will. That's coercive power. That's one. And there are people who run for office who esteem coercive power, who want the ability to tell people what to do. That is contrary to the Hebrew, the Christian, the Islamic scriptures. Yes. The other, for want of a better word, is is conferred power. People end up with it, but it's given to them rather than they seek it. And that grants them an authority to serve as one among than as one over. Is that sort of a summary of what you've said?
Very well summarized.
Now the mischief then is on what Dean just said, and a review of history and how when the leaders were both secular and religious, if you could say that, we live in a hugely diverse culture. So what are the cultural boundaries that our leaders have to, especially religious leaders, have to live with in terms of seeking to influence others?
Cultural boundaries. I'm not sure how to get my mind around that, Dan, but I think one of the boundaries that occurs to me that we need to honor are the kind of language boundaries. Each of us are part of a community and a sort of a subculture in the larger diverse culture, and each subculture kind of develops its own lingo, its own favorite ways of speaking. And we in the religious community especially, I think, need to learn the language of others and speak in the language of others in order to be persuasive, and not just refer to chapter and verse of our Bible or our Quran and say, because the Bible says, and assume that that kind of language is persuasive. We need to make the human case. We need to speak in the language of the values and the lived experiences of the people with whom we speak and attempt to lead, so that so we're speaking their language. Now that's a kind of a barrier or a boundary which we need to learn how to respect and cross and so on. Maybe one of you guys have the further idea of what kind of cultural boundaries required for leadership. I don't know.
So I think a leader can't be exclusive. What does it mean? So I was born into a certain culture. I was raised within a certain culture. I have a certain belief, and if you assume that is exceptional and is the only way, you may believe that way. But you as a leader don't have the luxury to act upon that. You have to be more inclusive, because you're not just ruling over a certain culture, but you're ruling over humans or people that may not have the same cultural values and beliefs. So it's your responsibility, it doesn't matter, to be just, to be fair, and give the people the rights they have and they need to live, to flourish, to survive, and to exercise whatever they think is right. The boundaries here are only set boundaries that may have a negative impact over others, where then law comes into place, where you cannot harm others while you exercise whatever you believe. If you harm, then there is a certain law that takes care of it, and you are in charge of, as a leader, that the law is being exercised equally and fairly to everyone. And from a materialistic viewpoint, I believe. And there's, again, when we look in different stages of Islam, how it's been evolved, and Christianity and Judaism, there was always others who had different cultural backgrounds, and they could live. They could live. No one was oppressed. I mean, there were wars. Sure, there were wars, but I think it was those conflicts were more about material things than beliefs in this regard, and the religion was just put as a flag to declare war, which I don't agree necessarily with it. But I sincerely believe that we as leaders cannot exclude anyone. If we exclude, then we have disobeyed God, according to my belief. Because everyone has the right to live and to flourish.
Well, we have rights and responsibilities, and there are no absolute rights. So nobody has the right, for instance, to holler fire in a crowded theater. So there are limits to our freedoms and our rights. So one of the things I think required of leaders today that is courage. Courage to exercise the conferred power that we've sort of identified. If we elect somebody, they're going to need to be, in today's environment, they're going to need to have some courage to speak and to listen and to make decisions and carry out their office, because you can't please everyone all the time. And even courage sometimes to exercise coercive power, because we live in a fallen world, so to speak, where people do unlawful, terrible things, and we do have police and we have military and so on, and we need to protect people, and so you always have the luxury of never exercising coercive power as a leader. And so you need to have courage, but you better, if you're going to have courage to exercise power, you better also have some humility and a little ability to question yourself. So it's really a combination of character traits and qualities that make a good person that are needed for leadership. Not just big talk and a big campaign budget, but someone of character to be a wise, good leader.
I think, though, some of the problem with our American politics is that most of our leaders get elected, and then about a year later they're looking to stay in power and stay elected, and so you don't see a whole lot of courage. You see a lot of looking into the next election. What do I need to do to stay in power and stay elected? And, courage and doing the right thing, I think it happens a lot on the way out of office when they're not worrying about election. Like with the president, he's only there 2 terms. Towards the end of his, he can do executive orders, he can do things that he really wants to do and not have to worry about the future quite as much. So unfortunately, we have a system that is driven that way, where in order to maintain power, you kind of have to take this middle road and not be offensive to the main electorate. So that's part of the drawbacks of the way our system has evolved, I think.
It's been said, when you're elected, an elected official, you're not just representing those who voted for you, but you're responsible for everyone. And that's what they always claim. I am your president. I am your leader, mayor, whatever. But it should be exercised. Because once you're there, you cannot distinguish yourself from those who haven't voted for you, or be less compassionate with them or more compassionate with the others. You don't have that luxury. If you do so, you may make others happy, but you also mistreat others, which then distrust to politicians, distrust to elected officials will occur. And that's what we're right now living. And I wrote something here. We're looking for the ideal norms for leadership qualities, and we need to rediscover those norms and not insist on those that doom us to fail. What are the norms right now? The norms are someone should be successful, where a successful business person is the ideal norm to govern us. But being successful as a business person doesn't make you a qualified leader, or doesn't make you adhere to those leadership norms, because it has to be questioned. How did you accumulate that wealth? When I look to the Old Testament, Solomon, according to Islam, is a prophet, Solomon. And he was so wealthy. He was the most wealthiest prophet ever. And in Quran it says, Solomon says, I love wealth because it reminds me of God. Because Solomon knew the wealth he had was not his, was given by God. And the only way to be grateful to God was to sacrifice his wealth to those who didn't have it. And that's the reason why he loves wealth, because that reminds him of God and of his duties and responsibilities. Now we look at a successful business person.
That's good.
I have billions of dollars. Okay, can you sacrifice half of it to the poor people? Then you're my leader.
Well, so if we can sort of bring this to the context of the American culture, we're a country of laws based on constitutional principles. What do our laws require of religious leaders in terms of what they can do and what they cannot do with regard to political opinions or ideologies?
Well, we clearly have a separation of church and state, and so if they're going to be tax-free entities, they are limited in the amount of political discourse that they can have, although you see all of our politicians going to church meetings and going to meeting with different religious leaders, so it's a really, I guess it's a very blurred line as to, at least in America, as to where that separation of church and state, and you do, I believe, have a lot of ministers from the pulpit exclaiming the righteousness of one candidate over another and other core leaders. I don't think it happens all that much, but it does happen, and so I think it's very blurred, and perhaps, of course it shouldn't be. I mean, it shouldn't take on this political type. I think they can say in general terms, like Azkan was saying, to look for the leader with the closest to God, and even if he is rich, is he giving to the poor? Is he helping others? Does he have the humility, the courage, the ability to really be an example and to lead and to show that God is within him? And so...
Or her.
Or her. And, even if you claim to be a billionaire, are you really? No, but that's a separate thing. But, I think it's important that there be this separation. It's one of the tenets of our political system, and it's certainly blurred.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that, Rob. You're a lawyer.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a preacher. Week by week, I preach, and these days, I tell you, it's really, really hard to resist the temptation to tell people how to vote. Dan, you mentioned the divide we have by law in this country between, you said religion and politics, but it's actually between religion and state. It's actually church and state.
Yes,
so
yeah,
it's
it is.
organized
Yes,
religious
yes.
churches, the institution of the church and the state. And here, Azkan, we've got an economist sitting here talking about money, and which is a lot about politics, and in fact, it's a lot to do with church and religion as well. It is hard for me as a preacher not to, as preachers, we want to speak to the issues of the day, but I certainly can't tell people how to vote. And it would not even be ethical from the pulpit to tell people to take a side on such matters anyway, because people have their own opinions, and in that setting of the church, people don't have the right to get up and say, "No, wait a minute, preacher, I got a different way of looking at that." So it's part of our own ethics, apart from our tax-free status as a religious institution. Part of the ethics of preaching is to not do that. And I agree that the lines are fuzzy, how far we take that, because we certainly want to speak about issues and matters of integrity and leadership and trust and all the rest. So we're all in this mess together, and it's good to remember that we could do better at listening which is where I started, and probably I don't have anything more to say than that.
I think it eventually also boils down to knowledge and wisdom. The knowledge that the position requires to administer, to govern, but also the knowledge of being a good person and how you're supposed to be treating others, which turns into a wisdom. The knowledge turns into a wisdom of knowing how to behave, how to react, how not to react, and how to treat people. And I think the wisdom goes then from the brain to your heart, where it's more your conscience, full of support with your faith and beliefs, the knowledge and the courage and everything that tells you whether you're qualified or not. Because only you as a candidate can tell that you're really qualified or not. We can just, from what you claim, predict or think, or, there's some evidence, but still, if you sincerely believe that you fit to these qualities, then you should run. But then you should also practice and live up to your premises or what you say.
Of course, Oskan, we have examples in the Old Testament about people who did not consider themselves worthy to lead, like a Moses,
Yes.
who God had to convince to,
Yeah.
come on, Moses, have a little courage now,
That is correct. So
yeah,
my
Gideon
point
and
here
others.
is, point here is, I always have a hard time to understand people who run for offices. We just discussed before this has been recorded. It's really a tough decision to run for the office because it's a huge responsibility, not just to your people, because if you believe, also to God. And I don't know whether I could take that responsibility. So ask yourself. And,
Could we summarize this as our time goes on here by saying that the consensus seems to be that religious leaders cannot tell people how to vote in countries like ours, where we all have one vote, we all have a privilege of voting. We can't tell people how to vote. But we can share the tenets of each of our faiths that talk about the various things you've been talking about and lay those out there as attributes that are important to who we choose for our leader from our religious perspective. And then the responsibility of religious leaders is over. They've conveyed the tenets of the faith that are important to leadership, the qualities of leadership, and then people are left to their own resources to pick and choose, to listen, to not listen, things of that sort. But just before we go, if we say that's important and agree it is, can you all give an example of somebody from your own faith tradition who exemplifies the best attributes of a leader as demonstrated then by people who willingly granted them the authority to lead and followed them?
Well, I as a Christian pastor, I'd hate to pass up the opportunity to say something about Jesus.
yes, I would agree.
Yeah, I know you would. And he was a good Jew.
Yeah.
I come back to the courage of Jesus to stick by his confidence in his Father. So is an exemplar of faith, that even when it cost him the uttermost, he did not sway, but hung in there for his people. We could argue theology of that, but he stayed the course in service to the common good, in service to the outcasts and to all people, even when it cost life itself. And because of that, I think he's become an exemplar for people of all different faiths and of no faith. People who don't like the church like Jesus, and they admire his courage and his faithfulness. And so in that sense, confidence in God as an expression of faith, not a doctrinal certainty, but a kind of a confidence to do the right thing, even at great cost to yourself. I can think of no better exemplar than Jesus himself.
Some of the less perfect ones could be Mother Teresa, the current Pope, Dr. Martin Luther King, people who express leadership by giving instead of by taking or wanting. Something like that.
Good.
Jewish?
Well, I was thinking at a more modern level, but I just saw an interview with Elie Wiesel, and he was a child in Auschwitz, came out of the ruins, lost most of his family, and spent his entire life basically being a leader in the community, educating the world about the hardships of the Jewish people, and I thought he was a very powerful man, and didn't let the trauma of being involved in World War II, stop him from a life in service to others. And it also struck me one of the last books he wrote before he passed on was about his open heart surgery. And it was just very striking how even through that he was able to move on and to be an example and to guide others in a life worth living. So.
Great example. Askan?
So there's so many examples I could give, but I have to admit, given the nowadays climate about how people think about us, Islam and Muslims, I don't know how effective it would be. But I want to give two examples, maybe one not from the Prophet, but from one of his companions, Omar. He was actually two, Abu Bakr and Omar. Abu Bakr was the first, actually the third who believed in him and Islam, and the third Muslim, the third. And he was very rich. And several times he gave everything what he had to the poor Muslims in Mecca, because at that time they were oppressed by those who still were believing or dead idols. They called mushrikun in Arabic. So he gave 3 times his whole wealth just to those who needed them. Omar was, if there's a movie about him and his life. It was the second Khalifa, and the representative from the Roman Empire came to Mecca to meet with the Khalifa because they want to get some agreement about something. And he was searching for him, and he said, "Where's Omar? Your leader." They showed Omar. He was just here sitting in a corner. He didn't have a real house. He didn't have nothing, which means a ruler at that time, the state was really expanding, the Arab state, and he didn't have one belonging, which means leaders can be good leaders without possessing any material thing. And then I would say Malcolm X from the very current culture, because when we look at how his life, from being how he emerged, he was believing in the Nation of Islam, and then he became a Muslim, and he kind of refused the notion and the ideology of the nations of Islam, because when he went to Mecca, he saw that it's not about ethnicity. It's not about being black or white. It's all about being human. And I think those are examples, I would say, that show how leaders should be all-inclusive and not seeking for material satisfaction. And that's tough, because it's all about opening up opportunities and giving individuals the opportunity to live, to flourish, and get ready for the life hereafter. And it's not about just accumulating wealth. That would be my last word. Thank you.
Well, I think we have to draw this to a close with great thanks to these three wonderful humans and great minds. We would just ask you who are listening to this, if you see it before the election on Tuesday, that one, you be grateful for the privilege of having a choice, a vote in who we choose to lead. Two, that if you have religious underpinnings, that you review your own faith perspectives and reflect on the fact that at least these three faiths are all in agreement that leadership is predominantly shown by a willingness to serve sacrificially, to serve with justice, to seek peace and harmony, and that you look very carefully at the candidates you vote for and see if they align with the faith perspective that you have and that the four of us here share. To that end, we offer you our gratitude for watching us. Please feel free to be in touch with us if you have any comments or suggestions for us, and we, as always, remain grateful for your presence among us and look forward to our next time with you. Thank you so much for watching. Bye now.
Thank you.